Hi there, welcome to Nonsense Whisky. My name's VinPF, and on today's episode, we're going to go back to Ireland and try some Teeling. Now, this is not Irish whiskey as you've tried it before. This is a very interesting take on Irish whiskey, I have to say, and one that I'm not sure if I've gelled with that well or not, but we'll get into the specifics of that once we've talked about it a little bit. This is the Teeling single grain. I picked this wee sample up in Dublin Airport quite a few years ago now. In fact, I picked it up as a 3-pack, and the first one, the single malt, I actually covered quite a few years ago on the channel, and that was part of the same set, so that's how long this has been sat on my shelf for. I covered all 3 of them now, so that's the single malt, the small batch, and now this, the single grain. The small batch is entry level one, it's about 30 quid. The other 2, the single malt and the single grain, are part of the Trinity collection, which is also including the pot still. They're a little bit more expensive. This one's about 40, and then the single malt is around about 50, depending on where you look. You get it a bit cheaper than that if you look in the right places. 46%, and it's, as they say on here, it's non-chill filtered, but they don't say anything about added colour, which I think is a bit weird. If you're going to go to the effort of saying non-chill filtered, you'd think you would put natural colour on there as well if it was. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. Don't know, let's not speculate too hard on that. Now, this is one of the few whiskies that I've tried, and there are more and more of these coming through now, where the website is actually surprisingly useful. I try to avoid most distillery websites if I can, especially the traditional Scottish websites, because they tend to be very marketing forward, and they don't actually really give me any useful information that I can use in these videos to pass on to you. This one, however, surprising amount. It is obviously the marketing gumph as well that you have to ignore, but this one told me a little bit about the mash bill, which is 95% corn and 5% malted barley, which is a very interesting mash bill because it's very similar to some bourbons, and especially obviously the high corn bourbons. I know like Balcones especially do a fully corned, and they do some other stuff as well. You know, there are a lot of these corn things around. So that got me interested. Single grain got me interested. You guys know I'm a big fan of single grain whiskey, or no nonsense whiskey. I preferred the high age stuff more often than I don't. So we'll see how this one fits in, because we don't know the years that are in this. They're pretty good Teeling at mixing in some high age stuff, because they've got a lot of stock. They went through some changes in their structure where, for a spell, they didn't have a distillery, and they just had some old stock from the previous distillery, and they were kind of blending their own stuff together. For instance, the single malt is reportedly to have some like over 20-year-old whiskey in it, maybe just a small proportion. Anyway, I digress. It's triple distilled in a column, not a pot. Again, very typical for grain, that is, but this is moving away from the bourbon-led thing that I went with originally with the corn. I was looking forward to that, and then I found out it was column still. Less interested in that because, in my opinion anyway, it's a little bit more of an industrial process. They can select whatever ABV they want to siphon off at, but I find that the flavours don't tend to get through, especially when it's been triple distilled as well. I'm not sure what that new make spirit would taste like. Then finally, this has been fully matured, so they say, in ex-red wine casks. This is ex-Cabernet Sauvignon casks from California. Again, not sure what influence that's going to have on it, but it's interesting to know these things before you go into it. Let's get into the whiskey itself and see what we've got, shall we? On the nose then. Now, it's a very indicative grain whiskey, for sure. If you know your stuff, if you know your difference between your grains and your malts, then you'll easily pick this out as a grain, without fail, I think. Very light, very floral still. It's got this vanilla-y notes to it, this honey notes, everything that I would expect from an ex-bourbon barrel, which this is not. So even going into this knowing that it's ex-red wine cask, I'm not being led into any tasting notes because I just can't find them. Let's try on the palate. So again, very grain forward, easily identifiable as a grain. I think it's got that kind of buttery cereal quality to it that you'll definitely know what I mean if you're into your grain whiskies. More of those kind of honeys and vanillas. Have to say again, really struggling to pick out any reason why I would think this would be a red wine cask. If I didn't know this was red wine cask, I would absolutely not say that it was red wine cask. Now the weird thing is, on the back end of it, I'm getting these kind of rye spice notes to it. This hot, spicy rye note that I usually get from my rye whiskies that I want to try them. Not a huge fan of rye whiskies. Try my hardest to like them, but very few am I clicking with at the moment. The finish is quite long for sure. It's quite spicy. Not really much flavour going on there, I have to say. Now, not a particularly glowing review, I have to say. I'm a big fan of the single malt. It's a lot of money for 50 quid, but I've recommended it to a few people and none of them have been disappointed so far. I know a lot of people like this whiskey, and I'm not bad-mouthing it at all. I just don't think it's suiting my palate. Big fan of grain whiskey usually, but this one just isn't fitting the bill for me. There's just not enough kind of oomph and flavour going on there for me. I have to say I think I might have preferred it if it was double distilled, not triple. I don't know, maybe even pot stilled instead of columns. Hard to say. I would really like to try the new make spirit from this versus maybe a triple distilled version of it in a pot still or something like that. But I know I'm never going to get that opportunity, so it is what it is. I just maybe think it hasn't been aged that long in its casks, or if it has got some extra aged stuff in it, it's a very small percentage. The vast majority of this, I probably believe, is fairly youthful to its detriment, in my humble opinion. Sorry if that offends anybody, because they do excellent whiskey usually. I really like the single malt and I really like the small batch. It's probably got a large portion of this grain in anyway. But for me, this one doesn't quite fit the bill. Not a huge fan of it.